welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. Let's begin our show with Harmony, the word to a new meaning today, as Chinese company Huawei unveiled on Friday its highly anticipated homegrown operating system, Hong Meng, or known in English as HarmonyOS. Huawei and its smartphone users, many believe, now have a backup plan for Android. It offers critical reassurance at a time when the telecom giant from China is facing a U.S. clampdown. Before we turn to our panelists about what it really means, take a look at, quote, the Harmony.
An armor of protection from the trade war. On Friday, Huawei officially unveiled its own operating system, HarmonyOS, at its developer conference in Dongguan. It is currently not meant to replace Android on Huawei smartphones, but CEO Richard Yu said that if it becomes a forced necessity, HarmonyOS is ready to go. Almost 3 months after Huawei ended up in a U.S. government blacklist, the announcement was a welcome relief. The company said HarmonyOS is the world's first microkernel-based distributed OS for all user scenarios. But the big question is, does HarmonyOS have mass appeal? Almost all smartphones in the world are running on either Android or iOS operating systems, with the lion's share for Android at nearly 86% of the market. Alternatives had emerged and disappeared over the years, even from big players like Microsoft and BlackBerry. Will HarmonyOS bring greater harmony to the tech world, or is it a sign that companies no longer rely on the global supply chain? What does this tell us about the future of mobiles?
Huawei's HarmonyOS, or operating system. What's in the new operating system? Let's ask our panelists, and what's going to be its impact on the overall competition. In our Beijing studio, Andy Mok, a non-resident fellow from the Center for China and Globalization. Also in our Beijing studio, long-time no-see Jay Huang, founding partner of J-Stone Capital and the former managing director of Intel China. In Boston, joining us from the U.S., Roger Antner, who is the founder and the lead analyst at Recon Analytics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to the Chinese guest sitting here in the studio first. Andy, what do you say about HarmonyOS? According to the press conference, how significant will it be, and in what format will it be available to us?
Well, I think that this new OS is potentially incredibly important. It has the potential to change everything. And here's why. Because it is designed for the Internet of Things. And what that means is that there will be 100 billion, more than 100 billion devices connected to the Internet. When we look at 4G, there are several billion people connected. So this will potentially change everything. And I know that there's some question, because in the announcement that it was a little bit, there were not a lot of details provided. But the question in my mind is that, the way I understand it, is that it is an operating system that is able to run on any platform. So whether we're talking about televisions, smartphones,
right,
other UAVs, other devices.
Internet of Things, of course, that's what it means.
Exactly.
Jay, let me go to you. If you look at the press release, it's quite sketchy. However, to what extent does it really provide as an alternative, HarmonyOS? I noticed one word our colleague Andy just said, which is potentially. That's a very interesting word that he used diplomatically. To you, Jay, what does it say?
I think right now I can see Harmony play an important role in the IoT domain. And the key question is whether they can replace an Android in the smartphone domain. It's unknown to me. It reports that if necessary, they may be able to do that. We need to wait and see. But historically, you look at this goal is a very aggressive ambition. If you want to say, I have a one OS who can cross the platform, including smartphone and IoT. That's very challenging.
IoT meaning Internet of Things.
Exactly. That means that we have one OS and across multiple ecosystems.
Right.
Nobody in this world so far has been successfully doing that.
Not Android, not iOS either.
No. I think that they, for example, Microsoft tried to use their Windows for phone, basically cross and PC ecosystem and smartphone ecosystem, and failed miserably. And Huawei seems to suggest that using Android for IoT, the operating system is too big for Android for the IoT application.
I see.
That's why, and then they started with Harmony. So I can see Harmony play an important role in the IoT domain, but I'm skeptical to see Harmony doing both on the smartphone and IoT.
I think Windows
I would like
didn't
you
work.
guys to clear your voice a little bit and also figure it out a bit. Andy, I'm going to come back to you.
Sure.
Let me also ask the opinions from Roger. Roger, what do you make of the comments your two Chinese colleagues just made? What do you also, how do you interpret the sketchy press release and certainly quite some interesting demonstrations at the Huawei press conference?
Well, we're in early days here. I think the project for the HarmonyOS got kicked into really high gear with the threats of President Trump to cut off the supply of updates and authentication and authorization with Google. So this is a show of strength by Huawei to the US administration that we can do this by ourselves. And by focusing on IoT, that's the low-hanging fruit where there are relatively little and few moving parts. Especially, it plays to Huawei's strength on phones, or particularly on TVs and IoT, where Huawei is a significant player in IoT and therefore controls the ecosphere. It gets, as my other colleague said, it gets a lot more complicated in phones where consumer choice plays a big role and they are hesitant to switch OSs.
I see. Andy, please, go ahead.
Maybe I can just add to that. But I think the reason why cross-platform operating systems have failed have not been for technology reasons. So Windows OS didn't succeed not because they couldn't build it, but because customers and enterprises didn't adopt it. The second point I want to make is that Linux is very big, meaning that it's about 26 million lines of code. And what that means is that it's bulky. It's also, that creates security problems as well. And this microkernel concept that Harmony is using is actually a revolutionary breakthrough that makes it not only more secure, but I think really a more able operating system. Google has a similar one as well, but they've never commercialized it. The last point
What was the one that Google had?
I think it's called Fuchsia.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the last point I want to make is that I said potentially, because again, I know that there's not a lot of detailed information, but my understanding is that Huawei could apply it to smartphones. And in fact, there have been unnamed sources that have said that Huawei will launch a HarmonyOS smartphone in Q4 of 2019.
It's very interesting, isn't it? That's the key issue here, whether the Huawei smartphones, because Huawei at this moment is the second largest smartphone manufacturer in the world following Samsung, but certainly in front of Apple at this point. But what's going to happen to the smartphone? That's the interesting question about the smartphones and the pressure Huawei is receiving from the United States regarding the technologies being used in smartphones. Earlier, I talked to Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's founder and CEO. He predicted a revenue loss amid a U.S. ban on Huawei and how long the company will regain momentum, particularly among smartphones. Let's listen in to what he said then.
In the coming years, our production capacity may decrease and our sales revenue will be about $30 billion lower than forecasted. In 2019 and next year, our annual sales revenue will be about $100 billion, but maybe in 2021 we will regain our growth momentum and provide even better services to society.
There we go. Ren Zhengfei earlier talked to me in an exclusive interview in discussion with others as well. Jay, go to you. What does it take for an operating system on a smartphone? Of course, I'm talking about popular smartphones, not smartphones that nobody's going to choose, but popular smartphones to be successful.
I think that number one is the ecosystem.
What do you mean by ecosystem? Explain in plain words to our audience.
Ecosystem means, and then your OS will be adopted by multiple phone vendors, not just by yourself. And also your applications will be running on your OS. And also the consumers would like to use it.
Those app producers would love to use your platform, which is the operating system.
Exactly. Write applications and then for you, not just for iOS, for Apple, or for Android. And that has for you. And then the end user would like to use it. Those are the, say, necessity and for an OS and then to break into, build his own ecosystem. That's a lot of challenges. And also particularly for Huawei, he as a phone vendors also has his own OS. And then he said, how can you convince the other phone vendors use your OS instead of Android if Android is available? If Android is not available, that's a completely different story. Historically, we see Nokia has its own OS called Symbian. It's extremely difficult for Nokia to convince other phone vendors to use Symbian as their operating system. We already see that's another failure.
Very interesting, the case study you just raised. But Roger, if you look at Huawei's phone, where it's popular in China, certainly, no doubt about that. And many Chinese these days even prefer Huawei phone over, let's just say, Apple and Samsung due to circumstances. It's also popular in some of the large areas of developing world, Southeast Asia, Africa, for example. Yes, indeed. And also, it is popular in even Europe, in some countries. United States, very difficult as a result of the political reasons. So, Roger, given the size in which Huawei phone market has conquered so far, will a Harmony operating system, once being tested on its own phone, Huawei phone, the users going to be able to use that, would love to use that, or it's going to be a very complicated process? Roger, your thoughts?
I think it will be the further away we go from China, both geographically and culturally, the more difficult it will get. I think in China, Huawei will be able to attract the developer community and the customer base for this to be quite successful. But the further we move away from China, the more dependent and more preferential they are towards either Android or iOS. So at a best case scenario, what Huawei can look at is a iPhone and iOS type scenario. Very strong in the whole market, but the further away you go from the US, also Apple gets weaker and weaker. So Huawei faces the same thing. One of the big steps that Huawei has to do here is not only base its operating system on open source, but make their operating system open source as well, and make it non-proprietary, so that, as my other colleague said, that more application providers will use it, and especially more phone manufacturers will use it.
Right.
But even then, it's an uphill battle.
Yes, it is an uphill battle, if it is a battle eventually. Andy, it's already open source. That's Huawei claimed so far. Of course, we haven't seen how Harmony would really operate at the press conference, but certainly we're going to see some so-called smart screen products of Huawei later in the year going to use specifically the HarmonyOS.
Yep. No, and that's exactly right. So that's why if I were Google, I would be very, very scared right now, because Android is primarily a smartphone operating system, whereas Harmony is positioned as an IoT. And what that means, it's IoT includes smartphones, but smartphones do not include IoT.
Right.
So I think this is potentially huge. Now, I think two very key points here we need to...
It really depends on how you understand it, whether the Internet of Things now already exceeds in importance than the smartphones or the other way around, I guess.
Yeah. Well, but yes. But I think the Internet of Things is developing. But I think the other thing that's very key is that the OS is not a consumer purchase. So I would not go and say, I want to use iOS or I want to use Android. The key audience are the app developers.
That's right.
And they only care about two things. How much money can they make and how easy is it to write an app? So iOS, even though, as Jay said, it's integrated with Apple hardware, you can't use iOS on any other hardware. But Apple has made it so profitable for app developers to develop apps for the iOS ecosystem.
This is very interesting discussion because all we discuss are about technologies. Our discussion is free from politics yet, including about app developers. But there is an element of politics and geopolitics over here. So what's likely would be the arguments from different sides of the geopolitics for the app developers if they look at their choices. Jay?
I think if I'm an app developer, so first of all, I'll see I write an application. How many users can use it?
That's right. Well, Chinese market certainly is big.
Yes, but the existing customers are all based on the, either Android
or iOS.
And also why the developer first choice is always iOS is because of because it's a hardware and software all in one.
That's right.
So lots of less compatibility issues than Android. So then the second choice is on Android. Now you may or may not have a third one. He's going to say, hey, how big this consumer base is.
That's right.
And then you may put it at the third priority.
And how easy it is for the app developers to be able to use these technologies.
Yeah. At Intel, we saw the similar things when Intel tried to use this hardware architecture like x86 into smartphones. You literally have to pay developers to develop a software based on their ecosystem. That's right. And that's an attempt. It's also failed.
It's a fascinating topic, gentlemen, even from the technological perspective. But besides that, there is a much more discussion, really, that we really now need to dig into about the geopolitics side, about the economic side of the HarmonyOS. For example, this event, what we discussed today, Huawei launched HarmonyOS, is only one hint as to how divided our world is today. Because for a smartphone manufacturer, it now realizes it has to develop its own OS system in order to exist and continue its business. So would there be a domino effect? Jay, that's what I'm thinking, that all important manufacturers that are getting their important components, technologies, and also parts from the global supply chain. Now, when they look at geopolitics and think, oh my God, I need to have many alternative plans. What if this? What if that? What kind of world is that? I have to ask you, Jay, about that, because it's hard for me to imagine.
My interpretation about Harmony's announcement basically says, look, today I have IoT OS. And if you allow me to use Android, I'll be happy to continue using Android.
That's right.
But if you don't allow me to use Android, I may have a backup plan. I think also in the chip side of it, we see the similar things. A lot of the companies, if today they're using imported chips, they feel very nervous. They all want a backup plan as what if happens.
But that means enormous amount of increase of cost because you have to put in a lot of R&D into all of this.
Correct, but there is no alternatives. And then what if your supply chain gets shut down? That's right. Your business goes down. So everybody is nervous. So I see this as actually probably unexpected consequences for this trade war. This actually stimulate and then China's development on the chip side.
But
Yeah,
Roger,
I
if
agree.
you look at that, it's not just between China and the United States. Now we are seeing also between Japan and South Korea, as semiconductor coming from Japan, very popular, used in products put out by Samsung and other South Korean companies. So we're likely to see wildfires really burning the whole grassland. Roger.
Well, we're seeing some disintegration of the integrated global supply chain that we have seen. And we are
Well,
seeing
it's not some. May I, sir? Because if you look at the U.S. and China, it's the first and the second largest economy in the world. If you look at Japan and South Korea, it's the 11th and something like the 5th largest economy in the world. It's not just some, but rather big stuff we're talking about here. Roger, let me go to you first, and then Andy, I'll come back to you. Roger, go ahead.
Oh, I completely agree with you that we're seeing the global supply chain separating slowly but surely, and redundancies put into. In the end, the consumer will pay for it because we will have more and more redundant capabilities in more countries. And development will probably slow down. So this is quite a worrying sign.
Do you think more competition, Andy?
Well, I disagree because, I mean, what I see
Disagree
happening...
about what?
Well, so the geopolitical question
Okay.
here is that this really is not that big a deal. Because what's going on here is that, yes, the U.S. and China are the two largest economies of the world, but this decoupling between the U.S. and China is, in fact, isolating and ostracizing the United States. Because there are other technology companies, NXP in the Netherlands, there are other European companies, South Korean companies, Japanese companies. And I think what the U.S. is doing is actually very, very short-sighted in that by forcing companies like Huawei to have Plan Bs, they're alienating and ostracizing themselves. So the U.S., if this continues, will end up being an island. And let's not forget that even though the U.S. is the biggest economy in nominal terms, all the growth is in China, it's in Africa. And we see this leapfrog effect now as well with smartphones, the next generation, that Africa, India, these are the places where the growth is happening. And the U.S., I think, is cutting itself off from that.
I'm not going against your argument, but if you look at the United States, still largest economy in the world, if you look at some of the biggest technologies regarding the tech industry particularly, it is still holding most of the IPs as we speak. Of course, there are other alternatives, but that is still a reality. Jay, I want to go to you also about your analysis. Now, this is what's happening, whether you like it or not. So the question really is, what does it mean for all the others? And this is only one area that we talk about, which is OS, operating system. Probably is one of the small component of the whole global supply chain. But this could happen to a lot of different industries, whether it's electronics technologies or biotechnologies or any kind. Of course, we want to contain this, the so-called war, but nobody knows. That's the issue.
I have to beg to differ with Andy on this one. I'll give you a live example. We invested in a startup company, and they design house in China. He outsourced their chip into Korea.
I see.
Suddenly, Korea has impacted because Japan shut down the supply. So he has to scrambling, find another foundry, maybe inside of China. I think this is happening in real time. And then I think that previously the assumption is, and then we're in free trade. And then in a comparative and advantages, and then you do where you think is the best, and then it give you quality, prices, etc. Now we have to put the geopolitical into consideration when we supply chain.
And that's the uncertainty, because no business could decide the geopolitics.
Exactly. Like another company we invested, previously say, I only need to build a factory in China. Now I need to build a second factory outside China because this tariff war between China and the U.S. And then that's absolutely add on more cost, and then for everybody.
I see. Before we go, I do have one question, a very specific one about Huawei. That is, almost 90 days ago, the U.S. Commerce Department put Huawei, quote unquote, on the so-called entity list. And then after a few days, after complaints from tech companies, it said that people and companies can apply for exemptions. Now, the exemption certificate lasts 90 days, which would fall on the 20th of this month in August. So at this moment, we see already Huawei providing an alternative plan to its users and its audience. So what does that mean, Andy, if you look at this trade war and its impact on companies' strategies?
Well, I think for American technology companies like the Qualcomms that are supplying the Microns, that are supplying chips and other hardware to Huawei and companies like them, they are in a very, very difficult position because they need the revenue. Like upwards of 50% of their revenue comes from China.
I see.
And these are very R&D intensive businesses. So if they lose this revenue, they will not be able to fund their R&D, which means that sooner or later they will lose their technology leadership. And I think because of this dynamic, this is really undercutting the China hawk's position in the United States.
Well, we'll see how things would develop, whether they really listen to the voices of the business community. Roger, your thought?
I think what we're seeing here is both the problems when you're getting caught in the political crossfire as a business. And while I agree that the impact on U.S. businesses could be quite severe in the short term, we could also see then that the supply chain diversifies away from China, and we have a lose-lose for everybody. So that would be the big danger, and the best thing would be if we all get along and we can settle the trade dispute and don't need to replicate all the capabilities in factories and supply chains.
Well, Jay, very briefly before we go.
We all would be better off with it.
Yeah, I don't want to cut you off, but before we go, we only have 30 seconds left. Jay, could you?
I think there will be some impact to American suppliers and like a chip company, etc. That's on the impact would be different on individual basis. On the bigger scheme, it's way to see how big the really impact it is.
But at least today, Huawei has given its answer. It is trying to provide an alternative to its users.
Correct. This is what I call the unexpected consequences of this trade war.
Thank you so much, Jay Wang, Andy Mok, and Roger Antner. Really appreciate it.